News, views, voices of the global Indian community. India abroad.
Well, I represent US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. It's a not-for-profit organization focused on policy between India and the US. We deal from geopolitics to economic to immigration to people issues. And we work very closely both with New Delhi and Washington, D.C.
So, I moonlight as an author, but I don't think that word should be used for someone who doesn't earn his livelihood from writing. I'm fundamentally a litigator with intellectual property, antitrust law, and constitutional law forming my areas of core practice. So the legal fraternity knows me as a subject matter expert when it comes to these subjects. The non-legal fraternity thinks of me as some kind of a civilization ambassador. I'm not sure that is entirely correct. I'm here to try and present my positions both from a constitutional, civilizational, and an investment perspective, and let's see how the convergence works.
Hi, I'm Satyan. I'm part of the Times of India group. I oversee the digital businesses as well as a lot of what we do internationally. In particular, we have a very large focus on North America and the United States. We run Willow TV and CrickBuzz, and we're part of the sort of founding group for Major League Cricket. We think of cricket as one of the important ways in which we'll see India's sort of capital expand globally. And then obviously the Times of India group is a large media group in India with a very long 184-year history. And through the last 20, 30 years in particular, I think we're starting to really see the growth of the domestic sort of capital and power of the Indian consumer, political bodies, whatever it may be, but also the growing international impact and influence of India. And we think of ourselves a little bit as a voice for that.
So let me start with Mukesh Agi. So Mukesh, what are you seeing as India starts becoming more of a global power? It starts exercising its muscle in the global realm. What are you seeing in terms of sort of US-India partnership growing on what fronts is it growing? Is it growing on AI? Is it growing on defense? And what do you think are the opportunities and challenges that we will see as Silicon Valley, and what we should be paying attention to, because these are things that are going to unleash huge amounts of capital? And the example for that would be something like the CHIPS Act of the US. I think it's a few $1 trillion CHIPS Act that we have. And so when you work with Washington DC and Delhi, what kind of things are you seeing, Mukesh, that you think will create opportunities for us here in the Bay Area?
Well, Asha, what we are witnessing today is for the first time in human race, a democratic nation of 1.4 billion people has shown a exponential growth in the economic arena, growing 7-8%. Its economy is now touching $4 trillion. Now, it is still a very small when you compare it to global GDP, which is around $105 trillion. So we are still around 3%, 3.5% of the global GDP. But more important is what we are seeing is the challenges India faces as it tries to grow its economy. One of the biggest challenges it faces is China. China, in every aspect, will never treat India as an equal partner. And that's where what we're seeing is an alignment taking place between China and the United States. US, for the first time after Second World War, is facing an adversary. When you look at Soviet Union, it was a military power, not an economic power. When you look at some stage, Japan was challenging US, it was an economic power, but not a military power. China is a military power, economic power, and a technology power. And basically, its objective is to basically dominate, starting with the Asia Pacific. It sees India as a challenge, and that's where India has to find a balance to continue its economic trajectory for the next 20 plus years without having war with its neighbor itself. It shares a border of 3,000 kilometers, which has been disputed in and out. And Chinese do realize that. So what they're doing is a 1,000-cut strategy. They moved 100,000 troops on the border. India has to move another 100,000 troops live. So it's eating into capital defense budget, spending less on capital investment, more on operation, and that's Chinese strategy. But US sees India as a pivotal partner. It basically has more joint exercises than any other country in the world, India and US. That's number one. So much more closer collaboration, cooperation taking place on the military side. If you look at what's happening in the Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean, both the Americans and the Indians are patrolling quite aggressively in the arena itself. India has almost 14 ships, around 8 submarines down in the ocean itself. Well, on the economic side, the trade has gone up to $200 billion. India's ambition is to take it to $1 trillion itself. And we're working on that, and I think that's doable, feasible, both in the mid to long term itself. We're looking at students. We have around 272,000 students in the US, contributing $9 billion in tuition fee. Another aspect, our objective is to take that to 500,000. And there's a reason behind it, because most of the students, 70% go into STEM program. And we'd like to use them because we have massive shortage of STEM program, engineers, educated people in the US. But then coming to people, we have around 5 million Indian Americans in the US and around 1.2 million waiting to get citizenship. The per capita income is close to $170,000 compared to the average American, which is around closer to $75,000. So their spending power is much, much higher. So I think what we are seeing is a closer cooperation from geopolitical side, military side, economic side, people to people side. And we see this momentum continuing both mid to long term between the two countries itself.
So, PK, you and I were talking about this at TED, that we should stop looking at India as a geographically defined nation state, because India is here too. I mean, we are here in a big way in India. The Indian diaspora is here in a big way, and we are connected in profoundly important ways to India. Not only through our startups. Many of us, like myself, who are in venture capital, we are investing in Indian startups. We are bringing Indian startups here, and sometimes we are even enabling mergers and acquisitions, right? So India is now sort of an idea which is fairly global in its reach, rather than sort of a nation state which is defined within the geographical boundaries of India. You're sitting in Dubai, PK, in a vantage point which is different from all of us. What are you seeing as sort of the opportunities and the challenges as we go forward, and as India rises in the global visibility and its aspirations as especially as a leader of the of the Asian region?
So, Asha, there are two distinct viewpoints or distinct points that I'd like to make, and which actually make India look smaller than it is. Its influence can be far bigger, its opportunity is far larger. The first thing is, people think of India as the 1.3, 1.4 billion people and a box in which it resides. The opportunity resides in the boundaries of India. I think the opportunity of India is far beyond its boundary. We all sitting here are the opportunity outside the boundary. We are sitting out here. So we tend to restrict ourselves in that, and I believe you to look at beyond. So it's not the US-India partnership I want to talk about. I want to talk about a global India partnership. It's far bigger than that. US-India partnership is very important. It probably is one of the anchor partnerships, but it's far beyond that. People sitting here, is your business only in India or US? It's far beyond. You go beyond that. So I think that is one thesis that I believe we should start thinking about, and we can think what is the influence we can actually take. The second thesis, which I sincerely believe in, is you've got to remember one of our biggest advantages as a diaspora sitting outside India is majority of us are first generation diaspora. First generation diaspora means a lot of us here were actually born in India, even though we don't live in India. So our relationships obviously tends to be far deeper. Our association tends to be far more connected. Our friends are still working there. Our friends are still friends in power, or they can make a difference. So all that actually makes our possibility of influence far, far bigger than would be from, say, for example, the Irish diaspora of New York, which is now third generation or fourth generation. So they do identify, but that identification is actually far behind. What that does to us is give us an opportunity which is far larger than what it appears to be. and it could be anything. You mentioned a few areas of this. That's just the beginning. I think we, as Indians, will influence everything. Cricket, Bollywood, culture, all these soft powers that we talk about, they will actually multiply, provided we are able to look at it from a point of view of being wider, or thinking beyond our boundaries and welcoming everybody.
So listen, this is all, excellent. We are all, happy that there is this US-India partnership growing. There is India is aspiring to be a global player. India is aspiring to be a $10 trillion economy. And this is all great. But we are also hearing murmurs within India, where we feel that India is waking up as a civilizational state, right, with its strengths. I recently had a very close friend of mine from Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., who went and spent an hour with Prime Minister Modi. And, his name is Walter Russell Mead. And Walter, when he was, sitting with the PM, said, look, what's happening in India? How do I get a flavor for what's going on in India? And the Prime Minister told him to go and look at, Varanasi, and said, you go see what's going on there and look at Ayodhya. Now, the thing is that this is something that's very important in the Prime Minister's mind and in his team's mind. And there is, I think there is a waking up of India as a civilizational state, which says, look, we are not just 70 years old. We are 3,000 years old. We've been around for a long time, and our value systems are what's creating a very important part of the global DNA of growth and of unity and things like that. But is it also creating, divisions within India that we should be aware of? And divisions are normal, natural, and healthy. Question is, are we speaking about it in a constructive way in which we engage everybody into inclusive dialogue? And that question I'm going to raise with Satyan later. But first I want to go with Sai Deepak, who is an extremely important voice in India in his thinking about the rise of India as a civilizational state. Deepak, what do you have to say about this?
So first of all, thank you for giving me an opportunity to discuss this subject as part of an unusual setup. I mean, seldom do people realize that culture and economics don't operate in silos, but they go hand in hand. And that, I think, is the realization or the story that India is going to present before the world. Whenever a society rises, it's not just a question of its economic rise. But the one thing that you end up asking is, what is it bringing to the pool of human thought? What is the India way? What does it represent? What is the idea that captures Bharat? So that is an essential question to ask, because according to me, even technology is driven by a vision or a value. Ultimately, there is a thought that results in an idea or in the fructification of a particular product or a service. So the first thing that I think Bharat represents is its fundamental belief in conflict resolution. Its way of addressing conflicts is very different. When you think of the Indian diaspora, by default, I think that's been the global experience. You're looking at an education-oriented, law-abiding, peaceful people. That is not a function or a quality of the diaspora. It is a function of being Bharatiya. Okay, so that's what you bring wherever you go. So that's one of the reasons you're not seen as troublemakers, by and large, hopefully. So that value, I think, is central to the idea of Bharat. Second, obviously, Bharat at this point is trying to reclaim its identity, its cultural agency, and its political agency. Because political agency without cultural agency is merely to apply the tools of the colonizing master in the past to try and create a future. But do you have something else of your own to use to forge your story ahead? That's the question that we're asking. When you do that, obviously quite a few civilizational issues and legacy issues are bound to surface. Now, either you show the guts and the maturity to address those problems, and you try and be as inclusive as possible when you have this dialogue. But you must realize that inclusivity or inclusiveness is a two-way street. All you can do is to open the door. But if somebody doesn't want to enter that door, then they've taken a decision already. That shouldn't stop Bharat from addressing those issues. If you don't do so, one of the things that I suspect, and that I think that's been abundantly on public display for the last half a decade or so, is that your growth story is constantly going to be hampered by legacy issues. You can build as many bullet trains as possible, but it will be subject to stone pelting simply because you've not resolved certain outstanding issues. So I'm very clear about the fact that Bharat cannot hope to forge its path ahead purely on economic lines without addressing certain civilization issues. That, I think, is what will ultimately give it the currency to sit on the high table of big powers. Because if you're internally weak, no matter how much you project strength outside, there is a fundamental hollowness to your strength or to your being, which will continue to plague you. And it could also hand leverage to people who are interested in seeing India crash. So I think it's all the more important for Bharat to address these problems. It can only hope to offer a peaceful resolution to these problems. But should people not offer, or let's say accept the carrot that is being offered, it must have the guts, the confidence and the political will to wield the stick within constitutional lines, both within Bharat and outside of it. I'm someone who's very clear about that, because ultimately it's not the constitution that dictates the destiny of a people, it is political will, the people's will, that dictates the journey of the constitution itself. The constitution, after all, is a product of people's will. So I hope that Bharat finds a way to address its economic necessities, because it is extremely crucial given the hostile environment it lives in. And it also addresses problems within, because that gives it the ability to spread its wings and not necessarily to flex its muscle, but hopefully to contribute to problem resolution, which the entire world faces at this point. Because Bharat, I think, has the strength to offer critical solutions to issues such as climate change and other aspects. And you need a calm mind contributing to these ideas without being divided in political camps as to whether climate change is real or not. If it is a real issue and if it is a concrete issue, then you need a calm set of minds to work on it. And I think we present some of the finest brains when it comes to the subject.
Thank you for that. I think you're right about this, Deepak, that the stability of India is critical as it flexes its muscle as a global power. And and I think it looks like, I mean, I'm not guessing on what the results are likely to be in the Indian elections, but let's say if the BJP comes back, which is likely to. If it does come back, we have 5 years of unprecedented stability and growth ahead of us. In which case, of course, we are looking at opportunities in AI, in software, and the usual verticals that we are all aware of. But in terms of bringing this conversation back to, what kind of stories are we telling? Satyan, you have an unusual perch where you are based here, but you also are the head of Times of India Digital, and you have an unusual sort of view and a snapshot on what's going on and on storytelling that we are telling ourselves, on conflict resolution, media narratives, and freedom of the press. What is your sense there? Is India on a stable path to maintaining those incredibly important democratic values that we've had all these years, and is it on the path to strengthening those?
It's a good question. I think one of the interesting things that is unique about India right now, from a media landscape and from a communication landscape, is there was a study done a couple of years ago about how optimistic are citizens about the future of their country globally. And India actually ranked higher than any other country globally in terms of their own citizens' perspective of the prognosis of their future. As a media outlet, we feel we have a balanced responsibility of being a reflection of the spirit of the country, as well as oftentimes being truth to power and things of that sort. But if you take a sort of macro lens, I think, generally the narrative is positive. Obviously, that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges and problems, and we have to find the balance between those. But when we look at media in America, for example, there's an enormous amount of division. And it's hard to find something that you feel gives an objective and representative perspective of the broader American story. You feel like there's this side and that side, and your job as a citizen is to sort of navigate those. And at least we feel like our role in India is not to be, one way or the other, but to be reflective of the broader story of India. And so that's what we try to do. I think the angle that I think is most interesting, which, I think if, Desai spoke about the connection between economy and culture, I think the other connection that's interesting is between politics and economy. And for example, the story we all will talk about and you'll hear 100 times is about the India stack and the digital India stack and those capabilities, and that's definitely a hallmark of it. But if you look even with a slightly longer lens, I moved to India in 2008, and when that happened, it was right when the financial crisis of America was blowing up. And India navigated what should have been a global recession far better than almost any other country, because it had more responsible and prudent fiscal policy at that time. And RBI was a little bit more, didn't let lending get out of control. Even in the last recession that happened, India fared better than other markets did. And today, I think the thing that's really interesting is, at least my old perspective, and I think a lot of people's was, if you want a very decisive and sort of faster moving government, you have to accept more dictatorial or less democratic institutions in places like China or Singapore, or markets where you'll see a lot of action, but not necessarily a lot of democracy. And so then democratic countries like America and India, well, they're great, they're democratic, but they're pretty slow moving, they don't really make big change, they're built for stability more than anything. And I think what you've seen more so in the last 5 years than before is you're starting to get a good mix of both, which is that you have a very democratic setup. India is still the biggest democracy in the world, but you really see a political machinery that is responsive and proactive. I think about, for example, we have a lot of investments and operations in fintech, and the amount of policy evolution that's happening around financial services in India is breathtaking, to the point where you feel like the regulator is as current as the latest startup. Whereas here you watch congressional hearings and you see congressmen asking CEOs how to fix their Wi-Fi. It's like a completely different ecosystem of the political economic connections. And so, what I think gives us that sense of general optimism around India is that you've always had a very strong entrepreneurial spirit. You've usually had a political system that was either negative to neutral in terms of supporting that entrepreneurial spirit. And today it feels like at worst it's neutral, and in many cases it's positive in terms of being an enabling factor for a broader growth story. So, I guess to answer your question, yes, there are challenges. There are, as a media company, we always have to balance this responsibility of being truth to power, but also being, able to represent the bigger picture. But overall, the bigger picture is really strong, and that influence starts in India and it expands into, the Indian impact politically, culturally, economically, globally, and we obviously have a lot of things that we're doing here to that effect as well.
So with all this, the optimism and the momentum that India is experiencing right now, how inclusive is our growth? Sai, I wanted to ask you, do you feel that rural India, for example, or Indians belonging to tribal spaces, in which this is a huge population, and of the Indian population, probably more than 50% is rural. How included do you think